It is about 12 noon. Hi, everyone. I'm Don Saucier. I'm the Faculty Associate Director of our Teaching and Learning Center. You found your way to our professional development series, and we're very happy for that fact. We're going to begin today, as we always do, with a land acknowledgement.
Okay, just give me a thumbs up, Don, whenever you see what I want you to see. All right, cool. Here we go.
As the first land-grant institution established under the 1862 Morrill Act, we acknowledge that the state of Kansas is, historically, home to many native nations, including the Kaw, Osage, and Pawnee, among others. Furthermore, Kansas is the current home to 4 federally recognized native nations: the Prairie Band Potawatomi, the Kickapoo Tribe of Kansas, the Iowa Tribe of Kansas and Nebraska, and the Sac and Fox Nation Missouri in Kansas and Nebraska.
Many native nations utilized the western plains of Kansas as their hunting grounds, and others, such as the Delaware, were moved through this region during Indian removal efforts to make way for white settlers. It's important to acknowledge this, since the land that serves as the foundation of this institution was, and still is, stolen land.
We remember these truths because K-State's status as a land-grant institution is a story that exists within ongoing settler colonialism and rests on the dispossession of indigenous peoples and nations from their lands. These truths are often invisible to many. The recognition that K-State's history begins and continues through indigenous contexts is essential.
Please remember
these truths
because we still remember.
Thank you. We have our professional development series meets noon on real time on every Wednesday of the academic year. And we also archive these for asynchronous viewing later. So if you see someone later and say, hey, you needed to see what happened at that TLC event, we're going to have it on our webpage a little bit later today. We think today's information will be real important for you. Next week, we're going to have a great presentation given by JT Lafferty. I believe he's from physics. He's going to be talking to us about how we can use undergraduates to enhance the learning experience for our students. But today, I'm very excited because we have Angie Brunk. Angie's one of our colleagues at the libraries, does amazing things. And Angie's going to be talking to us today about accessibility and allyship through change and uncertainty, which is a topic on many of our minds right now.
Excellent.
So
Thank
Angie,
you.
thank you so much for being here, and the floor is yours.
Oh, sorry, Don. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm Angie Brunk. I am a librarian. I also have, in addition to my master's in library science and master's in journalism, I do have a master's of applied science in human factors and usability testing. And I was born with a visual impairment. So this is very personal to me. And let me see if I can, because I'm afraid that I might, oh, here we go. I know sometimes this can be a little finicky. So, Dan, if Dan can monitor in case anybody is having issues. A little bit of housekeeping. I am not a lawyer. And nothing in this constitutes legal advice. I am informed. Lainey Feingold is a lawyer. She does, her practice is primarily structured settlements for ADA lawsuits. So I did, of course, pull a lot of information from her. However, I have been observing trends in accessibility for many years. And I'm regularly in contact with people both in education and industry who've been doing the same. So this is a combination of what I'm seeing in the news, what I know from history, and my own expertise on accessible design. I'm a very intersectional person, but today I'm really focusing on disability. So please don't think that this is in any way ignoring or minimizing the uncertainty that other people are feeling. There's no way to talk about this in a way that is completely apolitical. I'll keep it to a minimum, but we are talking about political issues. And I'm just going to acknowledge that. And I'm also going to acknowledge that, no, I am not okay. As I'm sure a lot of people are not okay. So I'm going to talk about the new Justice Department rules, which I know a lot of people are concerned about. It's actually not that scary. It really isn't. How the ADA is enforced, because I think that's something a lot of people forget, and that might be affecting what we see in the coming years. There are other laws that cover higher ed. I'm going to talk a bit about what I see, again, judging from history, etc. What I see is likely changes in enforcement. We're going to talk about how to be an ally in times of change. I'm going to go through a very brief refresher on web and document accessibility, but honestly, I've got other presentations on that that are still more or less correct. So that little bit can be thrown out if people have questions, and I'd rather people have questions. You know, this is thrown in there so I can provide more information if we get to it, but if we don't, like, there's so much other information out there. And also, if somebody could monitor the chat for questions, I do want to hear questions, but I cannot monitor chat and
Yeah, I'll
and
take that.
deliver.
Angie, I can monitor your chat.
Thank you. So the new Justice Department rules were on the website last I checked. Please know that, you know, we are talking about a time of change and uncertainty. So some of this information could become outdated quickly, hopefully not, but you know, that's just the reality we're living in. These rules were made using the full rules making process, and they'd have to be repealed using the same process. In other words, it's very, very unlikely that these rules are going anywhere. You know, I have student loans, like I'm sure a lot of you do. And one of the reasons that we ran into trouble with some of the student loan relief efforts was that they didn't quite follow that full rules making process. So, you know, these did follow the full rules making process. The ADA really already applied to state and local government websites, which is why it affects us, because we're part of the state government. All the authors of the ADA have said, of course, the ADA applies to websites. The web just wasn't a thing in 1990. So it's already applied. What this does is it offers clarity on what it means for a website to be ADA compliant, which has been lacking and has caused a lot of confusion. It also offers a slightly easier path to enforcement of this particular aspect of the ADA, because it allows complaints to the Justice Department directly if a website is not in compliance that is part of a state/local government. Repealing the relevant titles of the ADA would be very difficult. The ADA is a nearly 35-year-old civil rights law. It was passed by Congress in 1990 and signed by George H.W. Bush, for whom it was very important to make a large public showing of signing it, because the signing ceremony was actually held outdoors. So the ADA probably is not going anywhere. Some states actually already have laws that are very similar to these Justice Department final rules on the books, including Oklahoma and Colorado, our neighbors. The standard for web accessibility that you have to maintain by these rules is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines at the AA level. The current version of WCAG is 2.2. 3.0 is in the public comment phase. And if you are able, I would shoot for what's in the draft of 3.0. But 2.2 is the current working version. And please remember that these are a ceiling or a floor. They are not a ceiling. These are the minimum standards for web accessibility. And, you know, and again, if we have questions about these rules, I'm happy to go into in greater detail. I think an important thing to remember, and I'll touch on this later, is that there are certain exceptions that should alleviate some concerns that you might have. So how is the ADA enforced? One of the things that I think is greatly underappreciated is that the primary mechanism of enforcement for the ADA is what's called private attorneys general. That means, to break it down, that the ADA is primarily enforced through lawsuits. There's no government agency, with some exceptions, which again I'll get into, that goes around and does retrospective inspections for businesses built in 1980 or that regularly audits web pages for compliance. So, you know, the primary organism of enforcement is the lawsuits. The Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education is also another mechanism of enforcement for the ADA. Students can make complaints through the Office of Civil Rights as an avenue. And then they can do an investigation and, you know, demand corrections through that civil process, as opposed to suing being your only option. The Office of Civil Rights does some auditing of educational websites. And that has resulted in some recommendations for accessibility that are more in the line of compliance than actual usability. Because, and I'll explain later more why and how the OCR does some of this auditing, but this is not, you know, a huge operation. You know, as I was preparing for this presentation, I have seen reliable reporting that an upcoming executive order is looking at significantly shrinking the Department of Education. We don't know yet how that affects the Office of Civil Rights. But I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. Because a lot of this is leading to giving you the tools to stay informed and ask the right questions. Because this is a time of change and uncertainty. Other laws that affect higher ed, we are also covered by the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, particularly sections 504 and 508. Several agencies do enforce various provisions of this law. So I want to at least try to be as hopeful as possible. There are a lot of things that do not concern me when it comes to accessibility in higher education. The ADA and Voc Rehab Act, it's very unlikely they would be repealed. A lot of people would protest mightily, especially with the Voc Rehab Act. Do watch out, because there have been previous attempts at this, at laws that reform the ADA. Usually these take aim at making it more difficult to sue because of complaints about professional plaintiffs, when actually a lot of these reforms would make it so that only professional plaintiffs can sue, functionally speaking. So far, those have all been defeated. But if this is an issue you care about, you need to stay informed that these things have periodically come down the pike. They're likely to come down the pike again. It's highly unlikely that anything that attempts to reform the ADA is going to be a good thing in this moment, especially if it makes it more difficult for people to sue, which, like I said, that is the primary enforcement mechanism, functionally speaking. There are exceptions. Some of them I'll get into, some of them I can't, but just functionally speaking.
So Angie, I'm just going to
Yeah.
kind of ask a question to,
Uh-huh.
because this is how I'm sort of thinking of the discussion. So laws aside, I'm kind of wondering, what we as instructors, we as professors, we in higher education should be doing. So, not
Yeah.
necessarily what the legal obligation is, but I'm hoping you can kind of, steer us toward all this other stuff that's outside of our control, all this other stuff we can't predict. What should we be doing kind of from your vantage point?
Oh, yeah. No, I'm getting to that, but I wanted to set up, this is what we're
No,
dealing
sure.
with.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. There is reasonably robust case law, including the Domino's Pizza case, which says yes, web accessibility is an obligation under the ADA, and there is a strong advocacy community. Okay. There are some things that keep me up at night, though. History has shown us that enforcement of these laws in this particular context is not likely to be a super high priority. The closure of accessibility offices in executive branches concerns me for reasons that I'll get into on the next slide. The language used in the executive orders does concern me, especially things like saying in the FAA order that disabled employees should be replaced with high capability individuals. I am a high capability individual. Those things concern me. The fact that we are seeing this language used at the top levels is very concerning, and this does get into what I want instructors to do. Especially things like discontinuing ASL interpreters at press briefings, and some individuals in the president's orbit protesting the use of ASL interpreters at events. So in meaningful progress, and the thing is, accessibility is a journey, it's not a destination. And meaningful progress seems unlikely. Let's see. What I'm concerned with here is that a lot of best practices, in fact, normally when I do this, one of the websites I recommend is usability.gov. It's got a lot of really, really solid, easy to understand information. But with the closure of accessibility offices, I question how reliable that information will remain as, research and accessible design is less of a priority. So I'm going to steer you towards some other websites, okay? And right now, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has been ordered to stop processing LGBTQ claims. I think that's a canary in the coal mine, and this is something you need to understand for helping our students. It's still important that you make your website accessible. And if we do see less enforcement at the Department of Education level, you're likely to see more people suing. I can tell you I'm not in a super cuddly mood about all this. So how can we be an effective ally? Do not gaslight your students and act as if this is going to be okay. It's not. I know that you want to be positive. I know you want to help your students, but I can tell you, even as a very competent, seasoned professional, I just celebrated the half century. November, this is scary. And please don't pretend otherwise. You need to stay informed. Here are some, the American Association of People with Disabilities and Lainey Feingold, as well as the ACLU, are doing really good work on tracking what these changes mean, and how we can effectively enforce accessibility. Help your disabled students find disabled mentors. Make sure that you're making your own materials in classrooms accessible, and that includes, I've previously done some presentations on making active learning accessible, and that's an area I find that is still often neglected. So please, I have some articles on that. I have previous presentations. I'm happy to put together more resources if that will help people. When you hear ableism, please call it out. Let people know that that is not acceptable, and that is especially important right now. Be prepared with effective talking points. Know why it's a problem that ASL interpreters are not showing up at live events, because closed captioning does not keep up. Closed captioning is not fast enough. It's not necessarily accurate, and a lot of people whose first language is ASL have different skills in English than are typical. So more than 25% of the US population has a disability. I checked the stats a few days ago, and I believe the number was 28.7%. I just go with more than 25% because we know that number is an underestimate. And we know that, if you live long enough, you're going to have a disability. Make sure that you're able to talk about things like the curb cut effect. All of us use assistive and adaptive technology in our lives. As much as we like to curse autocorrect, that is actually developed originally as an assistive and adaptive technology. You use elevators, curve cuts, and ramps all the time. There is research that shows that websites that are designed to comply to WCAG are more satisfying for non-disabled users. And, just the bottom line is that we cannot thrive as a society if we are consigning more than 25% of the people in our lives to poverty, lack of autonomy, and dignity. And, be prepared, because all of us need to be prepared to advocate, to educate constantly. The language we use matters. And there's a lot more information about this. I'm happy to provide resources. I really wanted to see what questions people had, what more we could do. I use identity first language. I am a disabled person. I will use person first when I'm speaking with the institutional voice. If you don't know someone's preferences, saying person first language, such as person with a disability, is a safe bet. Please don't use euphemisms like differently abled. That's, I do not know any disabled person who prefers that. It's condescending. So, please avoid using euphemisms, avoid acting as if you need to talk around disability. Disability is the preferred term. It is the reality. Discourage and avoid yourself using a disability or diagnosis as a punchline or a pejorative. Lame, crazy, dumb, insane, please don't. That is, top level ableism. Don't say things like blind or deaf when what you really mean is that someone is willfully ignorant. Blind people and deaf people can think just fine. What you're usually talking about is people who are unwilling to learn. And it's very important that we're clear on that language. We're all going to screw up. I mean, I work real hard at it and I still screw up. But, be mindful. Be mindful of that language that you're using. If you have, and this goes back to those Justice Department rules, if you have publicly visible content It needs to conform to currently WCAG Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.2 at the AA level. Now, some of you, I realize, might have websites that are too complex. And there's a few things you can do here, especially for those of you who run like associations or professional organizations where you might have archival materials. This is one of those exceptions. If you have archival content that you still need for legal purposes or institutional historic purposes that would be impossible or very difficult to make accessible, you can put those in an archival section. But they have to meet certain age requirements, and those are outlined in the rules. And you have to clearly label that that's what it is. Now, if somebody actually needs that content, we're having a different conversation. If you are, this does not apply to, say, individual classroom or, you know, your CV website or things like that. But if you're running a lab website or something like that, or an organizational website, you might want to link back to the university's web accessibility statement and or create your own web accessibility statement. So there are limited exceptions for archival material. So if for some reason you have to keep a bad PDF of minutes from 1980, you probably don't have to do a retrospective conversion on those. This would also be a good time to think about weeding. There's a reason that libraries occasionally throw books out. They're no longer useful, or they've come back with material of uncertain origin on them. So this is a great time to look at content on your site. Again, especially if you have a larger site like a lab or an organization. And look at things that maybe you could get rid of. The less you have to work with, the less you have to worry about in terms of accessibility. And then have a documented plan for bringing your website into compliance and follow through. It's very important to remember that under the ADA and other relevant laws, they did not expect institutions to be instantly compliant. You had to develop a plan and follow through with it. So if you are very concerned, you know, if you say have a website that's very high demand for the public, have a documented plan to bring your website into compliance and follow through with that plan. And those are some important steps you can take for following both the letter and the spirit of those new rules. Some tools that I'm going to recommend, the WC3 consortium. Dawn, I realized I typed, well, no, I didn't. I copied the URL. That's okay. Something didn't look quite right to me, but I realized I copied and pasted it, so it should be fine. WCAG guidelines. These are your primary resource for determining whether or not your website is compliant. We also have accessibility checkers. And WebAIM has so many training materials. I am happy to answer questions about websites as best I can during this presentation. However, even when it comes to websites, I cannot know everything. So if I don't know the answer, this is something I'm going to refer you to. And you know, for people who really want to get into this, I also highly recommend the Quality Logic newsletter. They are a consulting firm that works in accessibility. And they are going to have, you know, they have I think it's a monthly newsletter. And they're going to have, you know, technology, legal updates. But this is probably for someone who's really much more into this. You know, I understand that that's might be overwhelming for everybody else. So let's talk a bit about how to use those 508 checkers. When you use a 508 checker like WebAIM, it's an automated tool. So what it's doing is looking through the code of your website in order to ascertain likely accessibility faults. A 508 checker is the first step. It is not the last. It's going to flag things that don't necessarily matter, that are kind of technical faults, as opposed to things that are actual barriers to usability. And so you want to look for those, and it does prioritize when you're looking at a 508 checker. Most websites are going to have at least some technical flaws. But you want to look for the things that are actually impeding usability. This is if OCR, the Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Education, does audits of websites, and they will use a 508 checker. I previously worked with a group that was trying to decide whether or not we should do alt text for staff directory images. The problem with that is a screen reader is going to, if you do alt text, unless you want to do a description of the person, which, yeah, let's not go there. The alt text would be the person's name, and then that would immediately be followed by the person's name and contact information within a staff directory. So from a usability point of view, it's actually better to skip the alt text because the photo is there for the CE people. It's not there for people who are using screen readers. And you know, the important information is already conveyed elsewhere. So that is an instance where it would actually be better to leave the alt text blank. But because OCR often uses 508 checkers, we are encouraging people to put alt text in there, because even if you intentionally leave the alt text blank, it will still tag it as a fault. So it's something to keep in mind in terms of how this actually functions on the ground. For accessible design, when you're looking at your websites, especially your smaller websites, one of the best things you can do for accessible design is keep your design simple. There are fewer things to screw up if you just keep it simple. Remember, you're trying to convey information. You're not trying to create great art. And a lot of times, if you use existing features in whatever program you're using, a lot of content management systems, including the one we use at K-State, already have features built in to make things accessible. It's going to prompt you for alt text for photos. So when you're looking at alt text should be meaningful. It should give me an idea of why you thought this image was important enough to include in the website, not just a boring description. Like, I should be able to get some idea of what you're trying to convey with an image, because hopefully when we're putting images in things, there's a purpose in mind. So having solid alt text is incredibly important, and follow those excuse me, follow those prompts within the software. Almost every web content manager now is going to prompt you for alt text when you add an image. If you're creating documents in Word or Adobe Acrobat, and I can show people what I mean if there are questions. you want to use the existing accessibility tools, which, you know, sometimes it's harder for me to remember because I'm a little old school and I want like really precise control over what font I'm using and everything else. But that actually can break some of the structure and some of the accessibility. So use those tools that are already there, like in Word, in Acrobat. And that's going to give you a lot less work on the back end to correct for accessibility. If we really need it, I know that we have some licenses of Equidocs floating around the university. And that is a program that allows you to set screen reader order for documents. What I would add is I think of my like core principle for accessible web design is to understand, and I know for some people who are designers, this can be hard to give up. You have to give up some control. Again, you're not creating great art, you're conveying information. And so it's really important that you allow the end user to have agency. I don't like to talk about universal design because for various reasons, that is a pipe dream. I like to talk about user agency. So assume that the end user of your website needs to be able to magnify the text, either in the browser or using screen magnification. And I'm happy to go into greater detail as people need it. You know, I'm always a little concerned when talking about web design, where to start, where to finish. So I'm happy to answer questions, and I hope there is some discussion. But I like to talk about user agency. So the user might have to swap out colors. There are some visual impairments where people need white text on a black background. You know, what is called night mode on your Kindle or your iPad. You know, for some people with visual impairments, that's torture. But there are various reasons that people need that technology. Much as it makes my designer eyeballs bleed, some people use Comic Sans because it's very similar to specifically designed dyslexia fonts. So when you're designing a web page, look at things like, what if my user substitutes in Comic Sans? And these are things that you can do right within your browser settings. There are accessibility checkers on Google. There are a whole host of tools, which is why sometimes it can be difficult to say, oh, use this specific tool, because different tools are going to work for different people, depending on what your needs are and what specifically you are concerned about with your website. And then there's the one who's really in charge, and my contact information for further questions. Now, okay, good. We've got time for discussions, and I can demonstrate things if people want. I need to know what's confusing, what's not confusing, and where it would help for demonstrating tools. So what questions do people have at this point?
So Angie, we've got some questions in the comments that I'll kind of share with you. So first of all, someone wanted to know for some references for some of the earlier statements about some of the things that are happening in our world.
Okay.
One of our colleagues wants to know, is there a reason we don't mark images as decorative if they don't add meaning?
Oh, that is one of my favorite questions. So there are a couple of options. You can actually mark images in certain, so for example, if you're doing something with captions, or like a lot of scholarly articles will have, say, a data table, and then that data is fully described in the text, you can actually do as your alt text. Data is fully image is fully described in the text. So that is one option. I would like to see, a decorative tag. I would like to see more flexibility in using intentionally blank alt text. But unfortunately, as of now, that is not an accepted convention. Does that answer the question?
I'm not seeing any follow-up on the question, so I'm not sure. Although Trina
Yeah,
may
I
have just
was
unmuted. Trina, go ahead.
yeah, I was actually asking this question primarily for Canvas users. So their accessibility checker will ding them if they don't have alt text, if they have,
Right.
some kind of banner or some fun thing on their site. So I was asking about that use of just marking as decorative in the alt text there.
Right. No, I agree with you on principle. And I think there probably will be some movement in that direction, because of various conversations I've had. But as of right now, that is not standard practice. But you're not wrong. You're on the right track. It's not, the accepted practice right now.
So Andrew, I have
Thank
another
you.
question, just clarifying
Mm.
on something you said. Someone asked, did you say that Comic Sans is good for dyslexia? No, sorry, dyslexia.
For some users with dyslexia, yes, it is. And there are specific dyslexia-friendly fonts. One of them is Open Dyslexic. That's the one I can think of like off the top of my head. But there are others I know that are specifically designed to be more friendly to dyslexia. Some people with dyslexia will also use color masking and highlighting. So, which is another good reason to stick to a fairly standard color family of like black and white or cream and dark navy or something like that. Because a lot of people with dyslexia will put like masking and also sometimes ADHD, because it helps them focus to have different colors for masking and highlighting. Um, and those are things that you can actually play around with. All of us have access to Read and Write Gold. And those are things that you can play around with within the Read and Write Gold program. So if you really want to know how your website is going to function, it depends on how deep you want to go on testing. I'm going to go deeper than other people because this is kind of my bag, but I understand, not everybody has the knowledge or experience to do that. But I'm happy to help people where I can or to point them to tools. So did that answer that question?
I believe that it did. The questioner has thanked you.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
You know, this is all great. And at the same time, I think there's a certain degree to which, like, the next level of representation is to let your students know, hey, this is looking this way because it makes it readable for everybody, or this is set up this way. It's different than a Canvas page you've interacted with before. It's different slide formats than maybe you've seen in flashier classes, but this means that everybody's included. And I am wondering if you have any experience about sharing that with your students or inviting folks into that awareness. I know that back when I was teaching, I was covering neurodivergence and how, you design differently for it. And
Right.
I got dinged in my T-vals for, like what right did I have to talk about neurodivergence, which was, like doubly painful.
Right.
So I'm just wondering if you have any tips and tricks for like
Right.
how to help folks into this awareness and acceptance
Right.
of things like Comic Sans.
Yeah. No, look, Comic Sans still makes my eyeballs bleed, but I appreciate the need for it. So when I teach, I do tell students that I'm visually impaired, and I talk about the technology I use, and I talk about, hey, please come talk to me if there is something that is not working for you, because I know what's needed. But yes, I think professors talking about, hey, this is designed this way to promote accessibility. And, go ahead and throw in, and again, I need to look up my citation because I've had another request for it. There is at least one study in the human factors literature that shows that websites that are designed to conform to WCAG at the AA level are more satisfying for disabled users. And talk about, how this is just better designed for everybody. I will say, when I've taught a recreational dance class, and when I did that, I am not afraid to say, look, I'm visually impaired. That means don't hide in the back. Or better yet, I'm going to be walking around. So you can't hide anywhere. And when I'm in a classroom, especially if it's a large classroom in a small group and they're all going to the back, I'm like, no, guys, I can't see you. Come forward. I think, and I do this a lot when I talk about accessible design. I've made mistakes in creating accessible design. I've occasionally snuck some of those mistakes I've made into presentations. I think it's important for us to talk about how we learn and how we grow, and the fact that, hey, like, I started a digital library in about 2009 from the ground up with accessibility in mind, but it would not pass muster today. I would do things differently because our understanding of accessibility, accessible design changes and grows, and the technology we have access to changes and grows. And so I think it's important as teachers to acknowledge that and to say, hey, I'm still learning about this. So let's talk about what works for you. Let's talk about what sort of features help you as students learn and absorb the material. Does that answer your question?
You got a thumbs up.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Yes, it does. I was too lazy to turn on my audio. My apologies.
That's okay. I mean, I could see the thumbs up because that was pretty big. So
we have time for maybe one more question.
there's no way I've solved all the world's problems.
Well, one of the things I love about the TLC Professional Development Series is basically we use this as an opportunity to expand our networks and our support systems. So I hope that everyone out there knows that Angie Brunk is here on behalf of all of us to help our students have better experiences in our classroom and achieve better learning outcomes. So please join me in thanking Angie today for all the wonderful information and guidance that you provided to us. This was a wonderful presentation, Angie. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'll let our audience know that we're going to drop a post survey form that you can fill out, especially if you're pursuing one of our TLC professional development certificates that I highly recommend that you think about doing. And I will let you know that next week's presentation will be done by JT Lafferty. As I mentioned, the title of JT's presentation is going to be Engaging Students as a Catalyst for Improving Courses, the K-State University Learning Assistant Program. So very cool things that JT is going to be sharing with us next week. If anyone has any additional questions, wants to stick around for a minute, we'll be here. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll have this up on the website later today for any colleagues who couldn't be here. And thank you so much. Happy teaching. We'll see you next Wednesday.
All right.